Back when I used to watch the internet's favorite Australian game critic, his ringing endorsement of the Thief games burrowed into my brain, and years later when I had my own computer, I picked them up on Steam. Last year I finally decided to buckle down and finish both games back to back, and I really fell in love with them. However, revisiting Mr. Crowshaw's discussion of these games, he has a specific criticism arguing that Thief 2 is better than the first game due to slight improvements in the level design.
The 2000 sequel, creatively named Thief 2, was the peak of the series, where the sneaking was the sneakiest and the sprawly levels were the sprawliest.
Which is weird because I came away from the games thinking they were about on par with each other. The thing is, though, that while I thought they were both excellent overall, most levels tended to have a sizable section that just kinda didn't work for me. Thinking about Thief and Thief 2 for this video as well, I started realizing they're kind of an anomaly in the pantheon of immersive sims, and challenged the three-part definition I provided in my video on System Shock 2. The first point was that immersive sims are almost always first person, but Thief obviously is. It's the second point, that most immersive sims have a strong RPG element, where Thief really breaks from the pack here. RPG elements are definitely the norm in the genre, from Ultima Underworld to System Shock to Deus Ex, but Thief doesn't have any experience systems or class building or leveling at all. Which complicates my third point, that immersive sims emphasize system-driven gameplay. Now, spoiler alert for the rest of the video. Can a piece of media spoil itself? Thief 1 and 2 are unquestionably system-driven, but in the last video we found out that System Shock 2's system-driven nature came out of its RPG elements, with different skills and resources allowing players to tackle obstacles in any way they saw fit. But the Garrett the player starts as at the beginning of the first game is the same as the Garrett that they finished the second one with. Well, I mean, aside from mechanical eye. Oh god, that's an actual spoiler. So, absent of all RPG elements, how do you create system-driven gameplay? And when you do find an alternate approach, how do you create a level around it? And given this, can we figure out why the segments of levels that fall flat, fall flat? For this video, we're going to answer those questions, and as an example, we're going to look at one of my favorite levels from these games, The Bank, as I also think it exemplifies the good and the bad of the level design from Thief 2. And 1. I mean, let's be honest, they play almost exactly the same. Despite being an early title in the stealth genre, the way Thief controls is really robust and unique, even today. Fortunately, this was around the time where first-person controls were becoming more standardized, so this should sound very familiar. WASD to move the mouse to look around, press space to jump and hold it next to an object to climb up it, Q and E lean left and right, press left control to toggle crouch, and hold shift while moving to sprint. The left mouse button allows the player to use their weapon, whether that's a sword that kills enemies, a blackjack that only knocks them out, or one of the various arrow types the player can pick up, and weapons can be selected using the number keys. The right mouse button allows the player to use the currently selected item in their inventory, which they can cycle through with the mouse wheel, and the right mouse button can be used to frog objects in the world, which are highlighted when usable. And that's about it for controls, other than a couple of small things, like press M to bring up your map, O for objectives, but Thief isn't a very complex game, at least control-wise. What makes it really unique are the two systems that govern its approach to stealth: lighting and sound. The thing is, most stealth games use a line-of-sight system for their visibility, which is fine. Thief has that too, because obviously it makes sense to have walls and closed doors block the vision of guards. However, it goes further by incorporating light levels into this system. If the player's in a more well-lit position, they're more visible, whereas if they're in a shadowy position, they're less likely to be spotted. Mind-blowing, right? The player's visibility is communicated to them via the light gem at the bottom center of the screen, which also brightens and dims based on how illuminated the player is. The player's visibility is also influenced by a couple of other factors. Not surprisingly, crouching makes the player harder to spot, and curiously, having their sword or bow equipped makes them slightly more visible than if they have the blackjack equipped or are unarmed. Movement also results in the player being more visible, putting more pressure on the decision to move or stay still. None of this matters if a guard gets too close or bumps into you, however, as they'll still detect and attack you, but for that to happen they need to get extremely close. The other half of this game's approach to stealth is sound. When the player moves, they'll create a certain amount of sound that, if loud enough, can alert guards into investigating. Standing and walking, the player makes a normal amount of sound, which is reduced if the player moves while crouching, and is increased greatly if they sprint. What's really cool is how this overlaps with the surface the player's walking on. The loudness of your movement is multiplied depending on the type of texture. For instance, grass and carpet muffle the player's movement considerably, allowing them to more safely sprint in those areas if needed, while tile and metal are very noisy, and even if the player's crouching while moving, they'll need to make sure they have a considerable distance from any AI. Now that we've got basic systems covered, I think now's an appropriate time to tackle that systems-driven aspect. I mean, obviously, this section is titled Systems. I'm going to pose this question again. How do you approach creating system-driven gameplay for your game? Some of you who have viewed my other videos might think to yourselves, well, Jared, you seem to claim that the design philosophy for both a game and its levels is on a case-by-case basis, and that what a game should be is progressively constructed through the act of developing it. It appears that, though design theory is important, there's no substitute for the actual act of designing a game, and that any approach to creating system-driven gameplay is unique to that game. And to that I would say, that's very intelligent and thoughtful of you, viewer, and I'm glad I've cultivated an audience of people as introspective and critically thinking as you. Stim and Response would have also been accepted. Randy Smith is a designer who actually got his start at Looking Glass, working on both Thief 1 and 2, and eventually working as project director on the third game, Deadly Shadows, when he was hired by Ion Storm. He's given a number of GDC talks, mostly in the early to mid-2000s, and in one he did with Harvey Smith, who ended up as the director on the Dishonored games, he lays out an approach to creating emergent gameplay, that being Stim and Response. Basically, the way Stim and Response works is it labels objects with stimuli, or stims, that they carry. For instance, a torch, a campfire, and a flaming arrow would all be labeled with a fire stim. Opposite these are responses. When an object gets hit with another object that has a stim, it checks if it has a corresponding response, which would be a set of actions. For instance, if a hay bale was hit with a flaming arrow, the hay would see that the arrow has a fire stim, and then execute its fire response, which would presumably to be ignite and add a fire stim to itself, so that it can also be a source of fire. And the thing is, this is not the hardest thing in the world to program, so I did. So I have two levels in Unity here, and they do the exact same thing. The player can move around and shoot fireballs. There's two flammable objects as well, a box, which the player can pick up, and an oil puddle. The player can light both of these objects on fire, and if they light one, they can light the other by having them touch. The thing is, these two scenes are implemented differently. One is done the way a typical programmer might approach it, with each object, on being collided with, checking that they're not already on fire. It then checks if the other object is of a specific type and on fire as well, or if the other object is just a fireball, and then lights itself on fire if those criteria are met. The other scene uses Stim and Response. We first need to create what's called a parent class, which is kind of like a template for programmers to create objects from, changing things as needed. We need a list to reference all the stims possible in the game, as well as a function, a chunk of instructions in the code, as the associated response, as well as a list for stims that this object has currently. After that, all you need to do is create a child class, which is based off the parent class, and write whatever code you need in its response functions. As for what stims an object has, that can actually be handled in Unity the way I've set it up, without opening a code file. And some of you might be thinking, well, that's not the most intuitive solution for this example, and it seems like a bit more effort, and that can be argued here. However, what if we wanted to add a water stim to the project? We'd add it and a function to the global list, create a water object with a water stim, and then implement the response function in whatever objects we want to respond to water. And the best part is, we can later add other water sources, and all we need to do is add the water stim to them, and they'll automatically work as intended with objects that have a water response. Simple. If we wanted to do this with the other method, we'd need to write a chunk of code for colliding with a water object next to the chunk of code for colliding with a fire object, and we'd need to do this for every object that we want to respond to water objects. And if you wanted to add other sources of water, you'd need to remember which objects are supposed to interact with water and then go back and add them to the code manually. Now, imagine doing this for an entire game, and you can start to see how things could go wrong. To borrow from my buddy Lamhoot, aka Dennis, his video on Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, provides good examples of this. The one that stuck with me most is how Dennis pointed out that shattering glass doesn't alert nearby guards, which, Thing is, walking too closely alerts guards, firing a weapon alerts guards, and throwing an empty magazine alerts guards. So you'd think that breaking a window would create the same result, but apparently not. Apparently there's an oversight by the team when creating the window object, in that, on the event of it being broken, it doesn't alert AI. It's obvious that this game was developed with a method similar to this add an object and try to remember all its interactions method, and due to an oversight because of how complex things got, this bizarre lack of interaction ended up in the shipped game. So to imply that Stim and Response is a reaction to this is a bit misleading, since Thief predated the explosion of sandbox games by several years, but incidentally, Stim and Response helps manage this complexity. Using Stim and Response, the Phantom Pain could have had all these things create a sphere collider with a sound stim, and give guards a sound response, which prompts them to investigate. It's simple, efficient, and above all, consistent. Using Stim and Response has a couple more benefits, and one of them is just a mental thing. Instead of having to remember a complex set of object interactions and trying to shape them into a coherent logic, you can think of stims as processes that occur within your game world. So instead of saying, in my game the player can shoot fire that lights crates and oil on fire, and these two things can light each other, you can just say, my world knows about fire, and then explore the implications of that. The other benefit is how flexible this approach is. You know what you can make into a stim? Almost anything. And it's because of this a lot of later immersive sims have used Stim and Response as well. Imagine making a game that has human and robot enemy types and you want to add grenades for the player to use. You might think, well, a regular frag grenade could have an explosion stim that all enemies could respond to, but there could be an EMP grenade that has an electric stim that only robots respond to, and there could be a gas grenade with a gas stim that only people respond to. Well, congratulations, you just designed part of Deus Ex. Okay, so what if we created a game where the player could shoot fire and lightning to create fire and electric stims, and those would hurt enemies standing in oil spills or water, respectively? Well, BioShock did just that. How about a game where the player has a gun that could shoot chunks of material that become solid, but can have a freeze stim to slow down enemies and an extinguish stim that puts out fires? Look no further than the new Prey. Hey, how about we have giant patches of grass where fire stim can spread and create a wind stim for the player to glide up on, and then we just slap a Zelda title on it and everyone thinks you're so fucking innovative. So yeah, Thief is one of the earliest examples to use this, and it's most apparent in the items the player has at their disposal. Water arrows with a water stim are able to extinguish fire-based light sources like torches and fireplaces. Fire arrows can similarly, with a fire stim, reignite them as well as be used offensively against guards. Moss arrows create an area that's silent to walk on, which is handy for louder surfaces when a lot of guards are present. Gas arrows create a gas stim that knocks guards unconscious. Noisemaker arrows do exactly what you'd think they do, creating a sound stim that draws guards to its position. Lastly, rope arrows can be shot into wooden surfaces, creating a rope that falls vertically that the player can climb. Admittedly, I think its logic doesn't run on Stim and Response, but come on, it's fucking cool. And this goes further. My hypothetical example of creating a sound stim to unify AI responses in the Phantom Pain, Thief already seems to do this. The sound system apparently operates by attaching a sphere collider to the player, and depending on how the player is moving and on what surface, can be given a greater or lesser radius. For instance, let's say the carpet has a loudness value of 1, stone has 5, and tile has 10. This means that the sound sphere attached to the player can reach guards 1, 5, and 10 units away respectively, simulating sound traveling farther. Using this, it's easy to modify this depending on movement speed by, say, doubling the loudness value and therefore the radius when sprinting, while crouching while moving halves it. But it's the way that this drives enemy behavior in the game that's truly special. See, Thief was also heralded as having some really impressive AI. I mean, for its time. And Stim and response seems to be the secret sauce here. When the player's sound radius actually collides with a guard, that guard receives an alert stim, and then starts investigating or chasing after the player. However, this means that an alert stim is added to that enemy, so that, if it crosses paths with another enemy, that one joins in as well, and also has an alert stim added, creating a ripple effect. Instead of all enemies being alerted of the player's presence the first time they mess up, or the player being chased by an enemy while others hang around bizarrely unperturbed by a guard running through an area, Thief, a game from 1998, is able to use Stim and response to simulate the spreading of information between NPCs. 98! There's a couple other odds and ends we should talk about, namely lockpicking. Picking a door is pretty easy. Just have one of two lockpicks equipped, and hold the right mouse button in range of a pickable door until you hear a click, meaning that a tumbler in the lock has been picked. Locks typically consist of multiple tumblers, so you're going to need to hold the button down for a while until the door opens. Each tumbler also needs to be unlocked with one of the specific picks. For instance, a door with 4 tumblers might need the first 2 done with the square pick and the last 2 done with the triangle pick. Lastly, if you stop picking a lock before you're done, you'll need to restart the tumbler you are on. Sometimes the player will see a guard with an object attached to their hip, like a bag of money or a key, meaning that it can be pickpocketed. The player simply needs to risk getting close enough to said guard in order to be within range to use the item, and it'll be added to their inventory. Something in Thief a lot of people have covered is its approach to navigation, in that the player actually has to use a map provided to them. It fills in areas they've already been to in blue and highlights their current area in yellow, though this varies in usefulness as few maps in these games could be considered comprehensive. Because of this, the player actually needs to figure out where they are and where it is they want to go, form a path, and then actually act on it. This is echoed in the rest of the UI, which tries to be diegetic as much as possible. I know I brought this up once in the last video, the idea of having as much of the game grounded in the fictional world as much as possible, but the UI of System Shock 2 really strains this. Mostly because of how much UI there actually is, which is a ton, but because you're using it so frequently, needing to keep an eye on your health and psi, as well as go in and out of use mode to look at your inventory. Though I'd argue that System Shock 2 still succeeds at being immersive, it's fighting its interface the whole time while doing so. Thief is much more successful at maintaining diegesis, and the biggest advantage it has here is that it's just a less complicated game, meaning that it doesn't need to show as much UI to the player at any given time. The only things that are shown on screen are the player's health, the light gem, their current weapon, and their current item, as well as their breath meter if they happen to be underwater. The thing is though, the currently selected item and weapon elements only come up when the player's changing them or if the player's actually armed, and then disappear after a few seconds, trying to keep the screen as clear as much as possible. Additionally, the weapon and item elements actually use the 3D models of the things they're representing, blurring the line between diegetic and non-diegetic. This means that only 2 UI elements are permanently on the screen, and at least the light gem is actually tied to a physical process in the world, that being lighting and shadow. By keeping distracting screen space elements to a minimum, the game allows the player to more easily connect with Garrett's physical presence. And that's really crucial because the player's position and movement are directly related to lighting and sound, the 2 systems that govern Thief's model of stealth. Though those go a long way to reinforce the idea of physically being there, this is further cemented by the player's different movement abilities such as crouching, leaning, and climbing, as well as small touches, such as fall damage and the way doors will stop mid-opening if the player gets in their way. Wrapping up systems, Thief's approach to stealth has some implications. Many fine stealth games have been made with just line of sight affecting the player's visibility, but because of this, these games tend to have the player hiding behind conspicuously placed obstacles or taking paths above the sight lines of AI. However, because of this, if you're hiding somewhere and a guard comes around a corner, you're almost guaranteed to be spotted. Because of Thief's lighting system though, you could be hiding in a shadowy corner inches from a guard without them knowing you're there, but because bumping into them or making a noise at that distance could instantly alert them, the tension is always present. And this is what's really mind-bending about Thief even decades later. It's not just that the player's made to feel like they're physically there, it's that they're also asked to be mindful of how their presence relates to the world around them. This is why actually reading and using a map is so significant in these games, and why most levels, after the player completes their objectives, asks them to go back to the start of the level to exit the area they just infiltrated. It's because every system in this game makes movement a strategic decision. It may seem quaint, but Thief was once considered cutting-edge technology. Like, someone at Looking Glass working on the engine put in a lot of effort to add shadows and footsteps that changed depending on the floor texture, and someone else there had the audacity to say, "We can make a game out of that." Additionally, this is the first Looking Glass game that really made vertical movement really robust. We kind of take for granted now how our technology shapes what we can and can't do with our games, and in a time when these limitations were more pronounced, Looking Glass really pulled this off. Thief made 3D movement meaningful, and the fact that this came so early in the history of first-person games means that if you wanted an example to justify first-person games, you could stop gaming here almost 20 years ago. Oh my god. We could have stopped. We could have stopped this. We could have stopped. So I know you're not supposed to summarize plots in video essays, but I think some narrative context for the level we're about to discuss is warranted. The first Thief game spends its first half just introducing the world, letting the player get to know Garrett, the protagonist, who became a thief out of necessity to survive. Because of this, he ran into the Keepers, a pseudo-monastic order that interprets prophecies, with whom Garrett keeps a loose affiliation. The Keepers see themselves as a balancing force between two other factions, the Pagans, who live in the woods and reject technology, and the Hammers, who see their steam-powered inventions as a way to please their god, the Builder. The back half of the first game is where the plot starts moving, which ends up with the Pagans getting pretty mad at Garrett. Because of this, the second game, subtitled The Metal Age, deals with a rising threat from the other side. The structure is similar to the first game. The first few missions follow Garrett in his day-to-day life, taffing about.
Nobody better be taffing around down here.
But the whole time the player overhears conversations about the Mechanists, a more extreme sect of the Hammers that split from the group in the time between the two games.
You mean the Mechanists, right?
Speak not that accursed name to me. They follow not the way of the Master Builder.
Eventually, Garrett has a run-in with law enforcement, and then is contacted by the Keepers, who tell him that the Mechanists have been pushing the sheriff to be more aggressive, and Garrett is asked to investigate. This leads Garrett to eavesdropping on a conversation between the sheriff and Karis, the leader of the Mechanists, who sounds like Droopy Dog with a messiah complex.
Now see, friends, with the builder's efficiency, I have completed 2 tasks with but 1 effort.
Fortunately, this incriminating conversation was recorded and stored in a safety deposit box, which prompts Garrett to infiltrate First Central Bank, where the recording is located, and is the setting of the level we're going to discuss today. Every level actually starts with a shop screen, with items the player starts with on the left side of the screen and things available for purchase on the right, the gold being obtained from the previous mission. It's a pretty standard loadout, as the designers try to give the player a bit of everything. However, it's worth noting that the player has the key to the safety deposit box, which was one of the objectives in the last level that needed to be fulfilled. Speaking of which, the player also needs to review their objectives. Obviously, obtaining the recording from the vault is there, but the player and Garrett don't know which deposit box it's in, so they need to search the bank's Hall of Records to find out. In addition to that is the perennial leave the building when you're done objective, as well as one saying get inside the bank, which, You know I was going to do that anyway, right? So the player starts directly facing this corner outside the building. They're in a dark corner along the outside wall, and there's some guards patrolling around there, but their path is really long and they start moving away from the player, so overall it's a really safe area to start. Looking at geometry and lighting, the initial read is pretty great. One of the first things the player's going to want to do is look at their map and figure out where they are. So they know they're at a corner outside. Looking to the right, the player sees a structure with a light being cast onto it around the corner to the right, the shadows showing that it's semicircular, and a similar structure is off to the left as well. Looking at the map, they try to find somewhere with two semicircles on either side of a corner, and that looks to be about here. This is what lighting does when it does its job well. It's able to help the player locate where they are without them having to move. Now comes the issue of actually getting into the building, and this is where making this video gets tricky. I offhandedly mentioned in the last video that Thief is way more open than System Shock 2, and that's apparent from the get-go. The player can pick the lock on the front doors to the lobby, though there's several security cameras, it's brightly lit, and the whole room is tiled. Gee, maybe breaking in through the front is a bad idea. The player can also go around to the east side of the building, though they'll need to circumvent the train of 3 guards as they start over there. From there, they can pick the lock to this hatch, allowing them to enter through the basement, though we'll talk about that soon. If instead the player headed around to the west side of the building, they'd go around this corner to see these conveniently stacked crates, ding, right next to this conspicuous buttress. Climbing up, the player can walk across and work their way up to the roof. From here, they can drop down onto this balcony on the north end of the building and pick the lock to enter the building there. But for this run through, I'm sticking vaguely to the path I ended up taking my first time playing this level, where I ended up close to the east side and picking the lock on this door here, letting me enter the bank while overlooking the meeting hall here. From here, the player can use a rope arrow like a badass and climb down to this area on the second floor, hopefully avoiding the sophisticated AI in this area. For its time, guys. Fortunately, there's a dark corner for the player to drop into, as well as another one at the north end of this balcony, which happens to be next to a door leading to another room. Dark corners are probably the safest place for the player to take a breath, so they'll probably pull out their map at this point. Keeping in mind their objectives, break into the Hall of Records and break into the vault, the player then tries to figure out where these two locations are. Both of them are prominently labeled on the map, and fortunately, the Hall of Records is right to the north of where the player is. At this point, the player is starting to be tested on their navigational skills, needing to mentally form paths on the map and then remember them as they move through the environment. The player moves into the side room with a branch heading south and this neat bridge to the west. South of the bridge is a prominent window showing a steam-powered robot guard, which we'll get into soon. The player then jumps over this really conspicuous patch of wood in the bridge and ends up in this hallway with a light and what looks like a switch. This is probably the most basic circuit set up in this level, though none of them get too complex. It's a two-way switch with a prominent wire leading to an electric light. The player hits it and turns off the light, teaching them how to use these and that messing around with them could be to their advantage. The player hits a T-junction with this hallway running along the north end of the bank, the floor made up of wood and carpet. Around the corner to the right, towards the Hall of Records, is a flight of stairs going down to the first floor, as well as a patch of noisy tiles. There's a couple of smaller steambots patrolling along this hall, as well as taking the stairs to look around there as well. It's pretty dark in this area with the exception of the tiled area which has a gas light and a torch by the door to the east which can be extinguished. It's best for the player to move while the bots aren't there as they'll only have a short window of time to move through this lit area. Opening the door, the player sees a room with a security camera hooked up to a turret on the far end. The door to the Hall of Records is to the north there with a set of stairs leading down towards it. Though all the lights here are inextinguishable, the entire floor of this room is carpet, allowing the player to safely sprint in the brief period when the camera's looking away. Closing the door behind them, the player is in the Hall of Records, a room devoid of AI, provided they didn't run in here after learning any. Specifically, it's interesting to note how almost all of the floor in this room is tile textures except for the ramp up to the safety deposit box scroll, which is wood, and the carpet right by the doors. Typically, the player wants to avoid loud surfaces for fear of attracting enemies. However, if there's no enemies around to hear them, then it's not that big of a deal. Regardless, the player heads up the ramp to this elevated area where there's a scroll they can put into their inventory. Reading it, the player finds out the Mechanist deposit box is number 11, so now they can head over to the vault. As I alluded to before, however, making a walkthrough of a level in Thief 1 or 2 is tricky. When I talked about design philosophy in my System Shock 2 video, I mentioned that levels in that game tend to unlock in large chunks, connected by a series of locked gates, allowing the designers to have a reasonable amount of control over the pacing of the level, while still letting the player not feel constricted. I also brought up, however, that Thief doesn't do this, instead presenting the player with a number of problems in the level that they can pick and choose from to deal with, meaning that any one path I choose to cover when making this video could be almost completely different than one you might follow, so I'm just sticking to the route I ended up going through on my first time playing. And on the one hand, it's possible for me to cover every combination of rooms that could be constructed into the tens, possibly hundreds of possible paths, but on the other hand, no. As a result of this, I ended up going back along the path I came, ending up in this corner across that wooden bridge. This time, instead, we're going to head south. The patrol path of Mr. Can't Open Doors here moves through here, however, so the player will need to make their move when he's not around. Opening the door with their freakishly long arms, the player comes face to face with a large Stim bot. Unlike the smaller variety who just run to alert other AI in the area, these will actually attack the player if they see them. These bots, invented by the Mechanists, were introduced in the previous level, a Mechanist seminary appropriately. There, the player could discover a note hinting that if they shot a water arrow at the grate in their back, they could deactivate it. This is pretty neat as it gives the player more choice when using water arrows, and is another example of Stim and Response making adding features easier. This bot moves on a short path back and forth, so the player is going to need to move quickly into this office area and find a place to hide. The area is split into two rooms, one to the north and one to the south, with a couple of electric lights and a couple of torches forming an X pattern here. The south half has doors to the east, south, and west, though the vault is to the west, so we might as well head in that direction. Going through an empty room, the player heads through the door on the south end and enters the room where the main staircase is. Not surprisingly, this is the area where movement between floors is easiest in this map. There's a guard who moves from the first floor to the third floor along the staircase, though the access to it is on the north end of the room. Given the player entered this room in the southeast corner, they're going to have to make their way clockwise around this balcony here over half a rotation. Though there's a light near where the player entered, as well as a light at the northwest corner, fortunately there's long strips of carpeting on these tiled floors, practically telegraphing to the player that they should sprint along here when nobody's looking. From here, the player can make their way down to the southern door on the first floor into this hallway, which is similarly carpeted. To the west is the door to the room behind the bank tellers, which the player will need to pick, but to the south is something interesting. It's a cylindrical room extending all the way to the third floor with a really prominent brass wire leading up there. This might be worth keeping in mind. Moving to the room to the west, the player enters the room behind the bank counter. There's a large Stim bot that comes in here from the room to the north as part of its patrol, but there's a switch near the south that turns off the overhead light here, though the light to the north will stay on. Going up these smaller flights of stairs to the bank counter, the player is now on the other end of the lobby, across from the front doors they could have picked open, which means that those cameras keeping the player from waltzing on in there are now right above them. But the vault is to the west, and we want to go through there, but we'd set off the alarm. But hang on, there's some brass wires leading from the cameras. Wasn't there a wire leading up to the third floor? Hang on, we gotta take a detour. Going back to the base of the staircase, the player can head up to the top floor from here, though a smaller Stim bot patrols the balcony up there. There's a door to the west the player can move through, with this bright marble room next to the Hall of Statues. Fortunately, there's a door to the southeast around this corner, which leads to a room with a dark nook off to the east. Heading through the door to the west is another office room. While the path between the doors to the east and west are illuminated, the area behind the desk provides some dark cover, though it's separated by this patch of tiling. Going to the west, the player enters some sort of walkway on the third floor, and can clearly see this is where that wiring was leading to. There's a torch in the wall in the middle of this overlook, but the area is so thin that the player would hit any AI walking there anyway, so it's not like extinguishing it would be much of an advantage. On the other end is a bar room that's completely illuminated. The player can hide behind the bar here if necessary, but that's really risky. The wiring, however, leads under this door in the northwest corner here, which the player is going to need to pick quickly. Going through, there's a lot of desks in this large room. Guess this is the security office. The wire leads straight to the back of the room where a giant switch is located, which the player can flip. This deactivates the security cameras back in the lobby, so let's just skip back to there to speed things along. From there, the player can pick the lock to the bank stalls and head through the west door out of here, moving slowly as to not make much noise. The room they head into has a carpet in the middle, but the areas dark enough to hide in are the corners here. To the north is a small hall, but it's locked by a gate. That's actually where the door to the west behind the bank counter leads, which is why I didn't talk about that path earlier. To the northwest is a room with a couple more desks and a safe. Around this corner to the left, though, is a security camera hooked up to a turret. Putting it around this corner makes its presence more difficult as the player can't see it from the south, meaning they don't know when it's looking away and therefore safe to move into the next room. There's a pillar near the east wall here casting a shadow the player can hide in, but running there needs to be precisely timed, as part of a guard's patrol passes through here. A couple of pillars provide some cover in this northeast corner, but this area is mostly made out of tile, so a moss arrow would really come in handy here. When the camera's not looking, the player can move to the west wall here, this pillar blocking the camera's vision. Moving up the stairs and through the door, the player can use this spiral staircase to head up to the second floor and head through the west door. There's a large Stim bot making the rounds here, so the player's probably going to need to hide next to the stairs here for a bit. The guard patrolling below also comes up here briefly, so the player's going to need to watch out for them as well. If the player's feeling really bold, they can sprint up this tiled hall, but the Stim bot moves south through here, creating a risk that the player will be seen by them. The easier option would be to trail it along the balcony in this other room. Right on the other side of the store is the stairs down to the room right in front of the vault. Unfortunately, there's a camera right in front of it, but as the players learned already, they follow the wire leading to this door under the stairs. Picking the lock, the player hits the switch they find inside, shutting off the camera, meaning it's time to crack this baby open.
The vault isn't going to open until that locking bar is out of the way.
Ah shit, there's this bar in the way as part of a locking mechanism. Fortunately, there's a grate in the floor showing the location of the mechanism, that being below the vault. Unfortunately, this means we need to talk about the basement. There's several ways the player can get there. There's two areas labeled to basement on the first floor map, the northern one being right below where we first encountered the smaller Stim bots, and one near the east end of the building. The player could also go out through the front doors of the lobby and enter the basement from that small hatch I mentioned at the beginning, but I'm going to focus on this way down to the east. Moving back along the path we've covered, the player can move back to the hallway to the east of the bank counter and proceed into that tall room with a wire to the south. This is a bit of a risky move as a guard is patrolling through there and there's a camera around the corner to the south, but the player can make a quick dash to this shadowy area in front of this door frame, then move through it to the north and hang out by these stairs. Opening these double doors, the player has a direct line of sight to the door to the room where the basement entrance is, but a camera's around the corner to the north, so they'll need to be quick about ducking into the room. Fortunately, the one light in this office can be switched off, and right behind the desk here is the trapdoor leading down to the basement. Moving down the ladder, the player moves from the southeast up a ramp into the room where that hatch from outside leads. Heading north and west, the player heads down this hall to the north with several rooms branching off of it. Oh look, here's a rectangular room off the hall that goes nowhere. Oh look, here's another rectangular room off the hall that goes nowhere. Oh look, here's a third room that... Okay, I should probably explain what's wrong here. A couple weeks ago, as I'm writing this, Robert Yang, a professor for the Game Center at New York University, put out this image, succinctly explaining some aspects that level designers at different stages of experience tend to exemplify. And incidentally, I just learned some of this stuff a few months ago at my own job. Generally speaking, when people start learning the theory behind design, and boy was I guilty of this, they tend to do a few things. First, their layouts tend to quite literally conform to the encounters they create for a level. Looking at the example Yang drew, you can see that in this room, encounter X happens, and then there's a transition hallway, and then in the next room, encounter Y happens. This very obviously telegraphs the design and pacing of the layout, making it feel really artificial. Second, new designers tend to create layouts that feature only 90-degree angles, making every room some rectangular prism and all the rooms and halls orthogonal to each other. I suspect a big part of this is because a lot of designers tend to first sketch layouts on graph paper, and it's easier to create layouts in editors that snap to the grid, but maybe that's just a problem I have. Lastly though is that newer designers tend to create these areas between rooms and halls that are just, like, solid areas. Of course, this depends on how realistic you want your game's layouts to be, but if you look at an actual building, more often than not, they don't have these areas of negative space. Architects in real life would need to fill those areas with some sort of building material, which would cost a lot for something that has no use, so why not incorporate it into the layout? Thing is, when I was looking at MedSci from System Shock 2, I was expecting a lot of these problems, and while it does cling a little too closely to right angles, it does a good job of filling in space most of the time. Again though, this may not be appropriate for every game. Look at Portal for instance. All the test chambers in these games have nothing but right angles, and they're shaped with nothing but the obstacles in mind, with no consideration of the space surrounding them. But that's the thing, these levels, fictionally, are man-made test chambers built explicitly to test people, which is actually a really clever excuse to get away with this sort of thing. A bank, however, is a structure that most of us are familiar with, so sticking to more realistic constraints is appropriate here. Looking at the maps for this level, even though they're a rough approximation of the actual layout, you can tell it does a fantastic job of avoiding these problems, with little wasted space and rooms that are varied in their shape and angles. But the thing is, the player isn't provided with a map of the basement, so I made a rough approximation of my own and... yeah. Now, people might argue that the no negative space rule doesn't apply to layouts below ground, as that's material that would need to be dug out. And while that makes sense, it doesn't excuse how the basement is almost exclusively at right angles, and how it falls into the room-hallway-room syndrome that Robert Yang describes. With that said, let's try to get through this as quickly as possible. At the end of this hallway, the player heads west into this larger room with some crates. There's an alcove to the north where the other set of stairs marked to basement lead to. Wrapping around these crates, the player heads southeast, then south. A note on the wall warning them about active maintenance machines in this area. The ground up to this point has been exclusively stone, but a metal plate is present right after this note, ending up serving as a heads up that more will be present. Around the bend to the west is another hall with a couple more metal plates in the ground, as well as some darker rooms to the north and south. Going into the closest room in the north, the player sees a cramped long passage with an S-bend that eventually leads to a room to the west. The thing is, all the small steam bots in this area pass through this place, meaning the player has a very brief opportunity to run through here, though it's still pretty easy because the area is pitch black. Going into the room on the other end, the player exits to the west to re-enter the main hall, which is more illuminated. After heading north across this metal platform, the player takes a U-bend, with a note warning that only authorized personnel should enter here. Heading south, then west, the player enters a room, hearing a large steambot in the distance, which is in the room to the south. The player then tries to sneak along the north wall where an electric light is located and steps on a trap in the floor that seems to activate the world's least effective turret. Around the corner to the north is a security camera, as well as a light with a wire leading to a room to the west behind that grate. Hitting the lever there opens it, letting the player enter and hit another lever which shuts off the light, allowing them to more easily hit the switch to unlock the room to the east of the camera where the locking mechanism is located. After the player solves the puzzle to undo the lock, which is one of those get all the switches to the off position but they're paired up in weird ways deals, the player heads back up to the bank vault, which I'm going to skip to because I don't want to add another 15 minutes to this video. The layout inside the vault is actually really simple. 3 floors, a camera on the first and second floor, with the second and third floors forming a square torus shape, and a pillar on each corner. There's an elevator between the first and second floor to the west, right behind the first floor camera, and a ladder to the third floor on the east side, closer to where the second floor camera is. Given the lighting and the cramped angles, the player needs to hide under the first camera, then get on and activate the lift, then run and hide behind the pillars in the southern corners while the second camera isn't looking. Running up the ladder, the player then rereads the scroll to remind themselves the deposit box they're looking for is number 11. Using their key, the player opens the box and gets the
compromising information.
The last objective is for the player to leave the building, and as they do so, the level ends. Admittedly, part of this episode's philosophy section is going to be pretty easy, not just because Randy Smith, who I mentioned earlier, has given other GDC talks specifically about stealth level design, but also because I've used his materials to make stealth levels of my own. In his slide, Smith starts talking about something called the MDA framework, which is an abbreviation for mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. Mechanics, and systems, are just rules of the game that combine in ways to produce rewards and punishments, and most people are familiar with this. Dynamics, on the other hand, are behaviors the player starts forming in response to said mechanics and systems. Lastly are aesthetics, which is how you wrap fictional elements around the dynamics and mechanics of your game and start to form the theming and narrative and all that. In the realm of design philosophy, though, we're mostly concerned with player dynamics, and looking at Smith's presentation, I started realizing he was bringing up the idea of pushes and pulls. Generally speaking, a push is something in the game that makes the player want to avoid or move away from an area, while a pull is something that makes them want to move towards there. Looking at the most basic obstacle in Thief, lights, a player will want to avoid them, since it makes them easier to be seen by hostile AI, so lights are a push. By contrast then, dark areas are a pull. Same with sneaking. Louder surfaces like metal and tile are pushes, with softer textures like carpet and grass as pulls. Rewards like arrows and pieces of loot throughout the levels are pulls, while AI serve as pushes, and are frequently moving pushes at that. Looking at these on a map, Smith marks these with a plus or a minus, almost implying they're like magnetic fields that will attract or repel the player. With this in mind, we can draw a pretty good approximation of what the player's path will look like as they move through an area. Thing is though, this also extends to elements of the layout itself. One of the most important resources for the player in a stealth game is spatial information, meaning the layout of the level and the placement of the obstacles and rewards. Because of this, blocking the player's line of sight by putting them in constrictive hallways or on one end of a convex corner makes these areas difficult to move through, essentially making them pushes built into the environment. On the other hand, spots where the player is able to overlook an area and preview the space before entering would be advantageous and serve as a pull. This is where those initial reads supported by lighting come in. Any placement of torches and candles you can make to make the layout easier to absorb for the player, the better. Like I mentioned talking about the beginning of the level as well as the System Shock 2 video, lighting casts shadows against objects, helping clue the player into their form and shape. Generally speaking though, you need contrast in lighting, light surfaces against dark ones. Because of this, places like corners and intersections are ideal places for light placement. You might already see a problem with this though when it comes to Thief, because blind corners are difficult areas to move through because they block off information to the player, and because lit areas are places the player wants to avoid because it makes them easier to spot, placing a light at a blind corner or intersection makes an area that could potentially be super difficult. And this might be appropriate for areas and levels that you want to be really difficult, but if you did this for every light that needed to be placed in order to assure good reads, that's going to be a brutal map. Because of this, lights for lighting's sake and light for gameplay in Thief need to be considered simultaneously, which holy shit dude, 1998! There are several solutions to this problem. First is the use of these hanging lights. Designers have access to several types of lights. The two most basic are point lights, which illuminate an area within a certain radius, kind of like a candle or a campfire, and spotlights like the hanging lights, which work like, well, a spotlight. Spotlights project a cone in a specific direction from their point of origin, and typically the length and radius of the cone can be edited, allowing the designer to more closely control the area they illuminate. The second solution involves creating geometry to selectively block certain angles from being lit. A good example is this room with the camera and the turret around the corner. In the middle of it are some, interestingly placed pillars, which serve as mounts for a couple of lights here. These use point lights, which again move out in all directions. Because of this, the pillars create darker areas for the player to hang out in. But the thing is, these lights are in the middle of a room, not a hallway or corner, and you wouldn't necessarily want to put a pillar along a wall in a hallway, since those areas are restrictive enough already, and Mr. Persistent here already seems to be having pathfinding issues. So what else can we do? Simple. Embed the lights in the walls. Because of this, you get the contrast in lighting on the corners of the alcove where the light is, and those corners cut off part of the light's angles, turning it into a pseudo-spotlight. To be fair though, a lot of lights are placed near important objects, especially doors to other rooms, to communicate their importance to the player. And again, placing a light right by a spatially restricting area, like a doorway, makes that a difficult obstacle to move past. Given that movement through space is the whole point of Thief, it's probably worth bringing up player containment. You ever play a game and manage to find ways to skip a series of obstacles? Yeah, that's really embarrassing to be on the receiving end of as a level designer. I mean, not that I would. Player containment refers to methods used to prevent this from happening. One of the most infamous examples is the invisible wall, and designers will try to prevent using these by actually dressing up the boundaries of the map as things that make sense blocking you. And as far as I can tell, this level doesn't use any invisible walls, and I can't recall any used in either Thief 1 or 2. But specifically, Thief also gives the player that cool rope arrow thing that they can use to climb up to floors above them, but it only sticks into wooden textures. This way, if the designer wants a higher area visible to the player but doesn't want them to directly climb up there, they only need to avoid using wood textures in that area. Lastly, we need to talk about space. Even if you applied everything we've talked about already perfectly to a Thief level, if it were just a really long corridor, it wouldn't feel like much of a Thief level. When talking about System Shock 2, I ended up realizing that a lot of its levels are divided into several areas, separated by choke points that require the player to solve a problem to unlock. However, most of Thief and Thief 2 take place in areas that aren't divided in this way. You'll certainly come across locked doors, but typically they cut off a shorter path to an area, with a longer and more circuitous one available, or else they'll seal off an important room where an objective or a valuable item is located. Even briefly glancing at the map, you can tell that there's almost always multiple ways into a room, those important rooms at dead ends being an exception. As such, player containment depends more on geometry and lack of places for rope arrow usage, as well as the AI itself serving as a softer form of player containment, pushing the player away rather than outright blocking them. For instance, my first playthrough I kept trying to move from the Hall of Records to the vault, but most paths in the bank that run east to west converge on this guard room, which is brightly lit, has tons of guards and robots, and is tiled on the ground floor. As such, I kept trying to find a path west, found out it went through that room, then backtracked and tried to find another one to the south, and kept repeating that until I found the path I walked you through earlier in the video. This has some interesting implications, that it's okay to make rooms that are near impossible for the player to move through as long as another easier path around it is provided. Randy Smith talks about this in his GDC talks as well. Stealth games, generally, have a lower threshold for failure since being spotted is a failure on the part of the player, and AI typically have a very short suspicious state that allows the player to recover. In an action game or a shooter, however, there's much more room for failure with the player's health, since it's intended in any given fight that the player will take a couple of hits. Taking damage is a slight failure, sure, but as long as the player gets to the end alive, they're rewarded with progress, and once you consider items that restore health, failing seems even more permitted. As such, Smith recommends designing levels for Thief in a way where it's possible for the player to fail, i.e. be spotted, 0 times. However, it's worth noting that if the player does alert a guard, it's not an instant game over. Similar to System Shock 2's approach of letting the player fail so they can dig themselves out of the situation, the player in Thief can run and hide somewhere, climb up somewhere the guards can't follow, or use one of their tools to help them out of a jam. And this is where Stim and Response comes back in. As mentioned before, every tool the player has provides a stimulus to interact with the world. However, if you notice, all the player's tools are used to modulate the difficulty of an area. Water arrows can put out light sources, moss arrows dampen the player's footsteps, noisemaker arrows can get guards to move from an inopportune area, and rope arrows can let the player circumvent obstacles and provide new paths. They're all tools to make specific encounters easier, which is something the designer can take into account. Regarding objectives, they're placed pretty deliberately apart from each other. It's not just that the Hall of Records and the vault are on opposite ends of the building, it's that the entrances to the basement are generally on the east end, with the vault all the way to the west. Because of that, the player ends up on the east end of the basement and needs to make their way west to the unlocking mechanism, and then back to the vault again. Because of this, the player needs to travel the length of the level several times, ensuring that they get to see large swaths of the layout. The bank is also a weird exception in terms of its objectives, as most other levels in the Thieves require the player to steal a certain amount of loot before finishing, which is especially odd because, it's a bank. They keep all the money. Because of this type of objective though, the player is made to explore the level in search of items to steal, making them experience even more of the layout. With all that said, all of that plus the layout stuff we talked about earlier is why the basement doesn't work for me. You'll notice it's really linear, with these areas serving as choke points, making all the paths converge. The only real places that branch off in this middle section are those long, cramped, dark tunnels, which the player is forced into because of the main path here being well lit. Thing is, these tunnels have a ton of small steam bots moving through there in both directions, which are so wide there's no way to move around them. And because there's bots moving in both directions, it's possible to get stuck between them and end up alerting them, which is no fun at all. By the way, this is not to say linearity in a Thief level can't work, you just need to be particular about it. For instance, instead of going for an explicit tutorial level like the first game, Thief 2 turns its first level into a tutorial. It starts out very linear as you're clearing a path for a friend to run through in the building, and depending on what difficulty you play it on, Garrett gives the player verbal cues as to what the basic rules of the game are. As you progress though, more paths start branching off of the trunk, as it were, and players can steal keys that unlock previously locked doors, retroactively opening up the level. Okay, with all that in mind, I think we can now form a solid design philosophy that was half stolen from Randy anyways. First, make sure the player can complete the level without being spotted. You can make rooms where this is impossible to steer them in a certain direction, but you need to provide a possible alternative path if you're going to do that. This doesn't mean that every room needs to be super easy though, just that it's theoretically possible for the player to move through it unseen. Second, understand the push and pull of the obstacles you place in the level and use this to estimate the player's path through an area. For instance, in this room with the camera and turret, the player wants to move behind this pillar into the shadow and away from the blind corner where the camera is, then move behind this pillar, and then sprint to the door when the coast is clear. Third, make sure your lights give good reads while simultaneously being placed well for gameplay. Placing them on corners will give you good reads, but may make that area frustratingly difficult to move through. Use a variety of approaches, like the overhead spotlights, blocking them with geometry, and embedding lights in the walls when necessary. Fourth, make sure the layout has multiple paths that the player can switch between if they feel like it. Most rooms above ground in the bank have 3 or more entrances, allowing the player to have choice where they move. Those that have fewer are most often either dead ends, like objective rooms, or halls that connect the more pronounced paths. And finally, if you have multiple objective destinations in your level, place them strategically apart to ensure the player can see a decent chunk of your level. You wouldn't want them to skip all your hard work after all. So there's more than one reason I wanted to talk about Thief 1 and 2 right after System Shock 2 on this channel. I said up front that talking about these games provides contrast in what an immersive sim can look like, and that's true. But more interestingly, looking at these games as a bundle gives us insight into the situation Looking Glass Studios was in while making these games. It's no secret that the company was always in a tight financial situation, and after Thief 2 had shipped, Looking Glass closed its doors in 2000 while waiting for their portion of sales to be processed. If you know what you're looking for, you can start to see this in these 3 games. Thief: The Dark Project was the first to use Looking Glass's Dark engine, which Irrational Games branched off from to create System Shock 2. As such, when Thief 2 used the Dark engine for itself, Looking Glass could more easily incorporate assets that were used in the 2 previous games. This is pretty evidenced in the things Thief 2 added on top of Thief 1. The security cameras, bots, and turrets built by the mechanists were the same cameras, bots, and turrets the player was facing off against in System Shock 2, with some minor tweaks. But nowhere is this more apparent and more relevant to this channel than in the reuse of levels. See, in Thief, there's a mission where the player is tasked with infiltrating a mansion to steal a sword, and as they progress further into the building, the layout starts getting weirder and weirder. It's a great level. However, close to the end of the game, the player revisits that map, which has experienced significant changes. Similarly, during that game, the player spends a mission infiltrating a Hammer convent in order to steal an artifact, and later in the game, the player tries to go back there to enlist their help with a problem, only to find out the convent's been attacked. But my favorite example of this occurs across both games. In Thief 1, the player needs to steal an artifact located in this place called the Lost City, a ruined underground area beneath the city most of the game takes place in. However, in Thief 2, one mission ends with the player stowing aboard a submarine the mechanists built, and the next mission starts as the player climbs out and realizes they're back in the Lost City, which the mechanists have started to restore in order to use it as a base of operations. So if you need to make more content for your game but don't have a lot of money to do it, reusing existing levels can help cut costs. Though this approach has the risk of coming across as cheap, Looking Glass made revisiting these environments thematically appropriate and still made significant changes to the layouts and obstacle placements for each reuse. Though they faced financial pressures, it's evident that Looking Glass put a lot of love into these games, and it's a shame they ended the way they did. But for the Thief series, all was not lost. The publisher of the first 2 games, Eidos, allowed Ion Storm, where a bunch of Looking Glass employees ended up, to create a 3rd game. Thief: Deadly Shadows is kinda seen as the black sheep of the series, but playing through it myself, I found it to be pretty neat. It's a game I think is worth looking at and might talk about in the future. And then there was the Thief reboot in 2014, which, I might talk about in the future. One, two, three. That was a good one. Hi everyone, it's me, Jared Mitchell, America's favorite level designer, until someone else tries to claim that title, in which case they probably have more of a right to it than I do. So I have an announcement to make regarding my Patreon as well as the channel as a whole. See, you know that studio Other Side Entertainment that I brought up last video, like Looking Glass 2.0? Yeah, they just hired me. It's just for a QA position, but everything seems to indicate to me that Other Side actually sees their QA department as a proving grounds for those who want to move up. Additionally, I'm still working as a level designer on Albino Lullaby Episode 2, so once that ships, I'll have a little more experience that I can use to hopefully convince my new co-workers that I would be able to handle that sort of role at their studio. So obviously things are about to get really busy for me, but it's my intent to keep on making videos for this channel as much as I can. Additionally, I kind of told myself when I started my Patreon that if I ever got a full-time position somewhere that I would shut it down, just because I didn't really feel comfortable asking people for money online when I have a steady paycheck coming in. But then I looked at my paycheck, and as it turns out, it's going to be $12 an hour, and I need to move to the greater Boston area in order to be able to work at that studio, and that's not the cheapest place to live. My contract lasts for 10 weeks with a chance of extension, so hopefully if they keep me on, that'll come with a pay bump, but I am not sure about that at this point. But if I ever do get to a point where I can sustain myself comfortably just on my paycheck, then I'll shut down the Patreon for sure. And because I'm starting a 40-hour-a-week job, I have less time available to create levels based on the games I cover, and even before I got this job, it was really tough balancing that with work on Albino and continued video creation. So I'm in kind of an awkward position where that money would be really handy right now, but I'm less able to deliver on perks for my patrons. So I'm planning on having this video out Friday, November 10th, and I'm going to delay charging for it to the 17th. So I'm giving people 1 week to respond accordingly. So if you want to stop supporting me, that's totally fine. If you want to revise your pledge to a smaller amount, that's also fine. If you're someone who wants to be a new patron but you don't want to be charged for this video, just wait a week until you pledge. That's also fine. I'm totally fine with whatever you want to do. And as before, my Patreon runs on a per video basis, so if things take longer than expected, it's not like you're making monthly payments and being charged more for less content. Also, if you were expecting a custom thief level at the end of this video, well, I'm sorry I couldn't deliver on that. As I've mentioned, things have been busy. However, I would recommend the Dark mod, which is a free open source game based on the Doom 3 engine that plays almost exactly like Thief 1 and 2. My last portfolio piece was actually a level I created for the Dark mod, which you can download from my personal site, and I'll leave a link to that and the game in the description, as well as there's this community that's still very active around the Dark mod, creating content for it, so please check out their stuff and tell them what you think. Lastly, whatever my current patrons decide to do in response to this, I want to thank them regardless. First off, I'd like to thank Chow Horde, who informed me that my System Shock 2 level worked fine on their computer, so thank you very much for that and confirming that. Next up, I'd like to thank my boy Lamhoot, Dennis, who very graciously let me borrow some of his Metal Gear Solid 5 footage for a segment earlier in this video, so thank you very much for that. And then, that's it. That's it.